All right, ready to dive into something interesting. We're tackling oil sanctions today. And I bet when you think about oil sanctions, you think like superpowers, right? Big countries using oil as a weapon.
Yeah, it's easy to think of it as this big league game, right?
Totally. So where do smaller countries fit into all of this? I mean, do they even have a say? This paper we're looking at uses Israel in the 70s as a case study.
Right, and the common assumption is that smaller nations are basically stuck. They either have to go along with whatever the big guys want or find a powerful friend to protect them.
Exactly. This deep dive is going to challenge that assumption. We're going to see how small states have actually played the oil game and won.
Absolutely. And just for context, the 70s were a wild time for oil. I mean, you had the oil crisis in 73, right? Really shook the world up.
Oh, for sure. The world realized pretty quickly that oil wasn't just like fuel, it was a huge political tool.
Exactly.
So let's talk about Israel. Now, most people think of Israel as being under a ton of pressure, constantly. But they managed to handle a major oil embargo without getting totally wrecked.
They did.
They didn't face those insane shortages other countries did. How did they manage that?
So here's where their size, which often seems like a weakness, actually helped. They didn't need as much oil as these giant countries, for one, but even more importantly, they had their own oil refineries, which was huge.
Hold on, explain that to me. Why were refineries so important?
Okay, imagine trying to buy, like, bread when there's a flour shortage. Everyone's after the finished product, so it's expensive, hard to get. But what if you could just buy the wheat and make the bread yourself? That's what Israel did, basically.
Ah, I see. So they cut out the middleman.
Exactly. Crude oil, it's easier to get your hands on even during sanctions.
Mm.
And they could refine it themselves. Bypassed all the chaos.
The lever. So they weren't at the mercy of everyone else scrambling for the refined stuff. This must have made them pretty attractive to certain sellers on the global market, right?
You got it. They were a dream come true for what we call sanctions busters.
Mm.
These are countries or companies willing to sell to buyers even when sanctions are in place.
Sanctions busters, huh? Okay, now this is where it gets interesting.
Yeah.
Give me a good example of this in action. How did Israel work with one of these resourceful suppliers?
All right, so let's rewind to 1974. Tensions within OPEC are running high. You've got Ecuador, a fairly new oil producer, eager to sell more oil, but they're facing pushback from the big guys in OPEC, particularly some of the Arab members.
And I can only imagine that given the whole oil crisis thing, those Arab members weren't exactly thrilled about sharing, right?
Exactly. It's a very delicate situation politically. Now, Israel, they desperately need a new oil source. Ecuador wants a buyer who won't cause too much drama. It was a perfect opportunity, even if it was a bit controversial.
So they made a deal. What did that look like?
It was a power move, really. Israel agrees to buy Ecuadorian oil, even though it wasn't the cheapest.
Huh.
But this deal went beyond just oil and money. It was a statement. Ecuador's president at the time publicly announces they're selling to Israel, a direct challenge to the embargo.
Wow. Talk about sticking it to the man. So what happened in the long run? I bet that ruffled some feathers. So Ecuador gets to sell its oil, and Israel gets the resources it desperately needs. What a story. But this wasn't just a one-time thing, right?
Right. This wasn't just about getting around those sanctions.
Yeah.
This deal, it opened the door for a much bigger relationship between the two countries. Remember that spillover effect we talked about?
Yeah.
This is a perfect example. That initial oil deal, it snowballed into something much bigger.
Okay, so what are we talking about here? Beyond oil, what else is on the table?
Think about, like, arms deals, exchanging agricultural tech, even intelligence sharing. This became a full-blown partnership, proving that sometimes the real value of a deal isn't just what's being traded, right? It's the connections you make.
Fascinating. It all started with oil, and they
Right.
built this whole relationship out of it.
Exactly. It's a classic example of a smaller country using its assets, even under pressure, to create something really valuable on the world stage.
Love it. But I'm guessing this strategy doesn't always work out so perfectly, does it?
You're right. As with any strategy, there are limitations, right? The world of oil, it's incredibly complex. The political landscape is always shifting. And sometimes those shifts, they create obstacles you just can't overcome.
Okay, so what happened? Give me an example.
Well, the paper talks about what happened to Israel after the Iranian Revolution in '79.
Ah, right. The Iranian Revolution. Talk about a game changer in the Middle East. How did this affect Israel's whole oil strategy?
So remember how Israel had to give the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt as part of that peace treaty?
Yeah.
Well, that meant losing those oil fields in the Sinai. And then, boom, the revolution in Iran happens. Suddenly, Israel's in a really tight spot.
Double whammy. They lost a key supplier and a bunch of oil fields at the same time. That's rough. How did they handle that?
They had to move quickly to find new sources for their oil. They did manage to strike a pretty good deal with Mexico, which wasn't part of OPEC.
Smart.
And they tried to sort of replicate that Ecuador success story. They approached Norway. They approached the UK. Both had North Sea oil.
So same playbook as before. Find countries open to new partnerships, willing to take a bit of a risk.
Yeah, exactly. But things were different this time. The political climate, it had changed. The risks for Norway and the UK, they were just too high.
Too high? What do you mean?
Well, they wanted to keep those strong relationships with Arab countries and openly trading oil with Israel. It could have jeopardized those relationships,
So they needed those Arab partnerships more than they needed to make a deal with Israel, even if Israel needed the oil. So what did Israel do? Just cut their losses?
Well, the U.S. actually got involved. They tried to convince Norway and the U.K. to reconsider.
Really?
Yeah. It didn't work. Not even the U.S. could make it happen.
Wow. So even with the U.S. backing them up, it wasn't enough. What's the takeaway there?
It shows that even when you have a need, even when you make a good offer, sometimes there are these bigger geopolitical forces at play. And if you're a small country, sometimes you lose out.
It's a tough lesson. So what can we learn from this? From Israel's success with Ecuador and then those struggles after Iran, it seems like you need the perfect conditions for this kind of strategy to work.
You're absolutely right. It's not a guaranteed win every time. So looking back at these examples, we can actually pinpoint 4 key conditions that determine if a sanctions-busting oil deal will be successful for a smaller state. The first thing is, the seller, they got to be confident enough to deal with any potential blowback from their usual trading partners, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Like with Ecuador, they were already kind of on the outs with some of those OPEC members, so they had less to lose.
Right. You need to find those who aren't afraid to shake things up a bit.
Got it. Okay, what's next?
So the second condition is all about leverage, specifically the buyer's leverage. The small country, the one dealing with the sanctions, they can't seem desperate.
So it's better to have options, even if they aren't perfect.
Exactly. It gives them room to negotiate.
Like how Israel had that deal with Mexico while they were talking with Norway and the UK. Gave them a little breathing room.
Exactly. And it ties into the third condition.
Yeah.
The seller needs a good reason to take a chance on a new buyer.
So there needs to be more to it than just getting around the sanctions. It can't just be about the money, right?
Right. There needs to be a bigger reason, a shared interest that goes beyond just that one deal.
Okay, I'm intrigued. We've got the seller's reasons, the buyer's need for options. What's the last piece of the puzzle? What else do these successful deals have in common? Okay, so we've got the seller's reasons, the buyer's need for options. What's the last piece of the puzzle? What else do these successful deals have in common?
This last one is key. The buyer, they can't just bring money to the table. They need to offer something else. Think weapons, technology,
Right.
political connections, things that are hard to get through, normal channels.
Right. Got to sweeten the deal.
Exactly. And remember that whole spillover effect idea.
Yeah.
It's about creating a deeper partnership. Oil is just the start.
Okay, so like how Israel offered arms and agricultural help to Ecuador.
Exactly. They gave them something valuable that was hard to get elsewhere. And these kinds of relationships, they give small states surprising power in the oil market. Because oil, it's not just about who has it, it's about the influence that comes with it.
So even though the big players seem to control everything, smaller countries can still make their move if they're smart about it.
Absolutely. That's a big takeaway from all of this. It challenges our whole idea of who really holds the power when it comes to oil.
Makes you think twice about those headlines about oil deals, There's always more to the story.
Definitely. Oil is a political tool, plain and simple.
Nice.
And it can be used in some pretty surprising ways.
This has been fascinating. Thanks for walking us through this. I feel like I get it now.
Glad to do it. It's a fascinating topic.
And for our listeners, if this got you thinking, definitely check out the research. You might be surprised what else you discover about oil, power, and how it all works on the world stage. Until next time.